Now, Joe Gersh is a prominent Melbourne businessman who served on the ABC board since May 2018. He's been appointed by both sides of politics to prestigious board posts. Peter Costello appointed him to be a foundation director of the Reserve Bank of Australia's Payment Systems Board. And at the end of his term, he was the longest ever serving member of any board of the RBA because he had been reappointed by Wayne Swan. His term as ABC director is about to finish in a couple of months' time in May, and he joins me live now in the studio. So great to see you, Joe.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Now, I have to start with asking you about ABC bias. There have been so many attempts to fix bias at the ABC through appointments like yours. Why has no one ever been able to fix it? Why has the board been so ineffective?
Well, that's a loaded question. I'm not sure I agree with the premise of it, but the reason that I've been vocal as an ABC director, because generally speaking, ABC directors don't comment on board matters, and the ABC speaks through its chair, our formidable chair, Arto Buttrose.
Yes.
But I've been vocal in the defence of ABC because there have been calls from many, including some who've served previously on ABC boards, for the ABC to be defunded or to be privatised or to be reduced to what they consider is evidence of market failure. I'm against all of those things, and I've said so publicly. At the same time, I've said that if you wanted to be objective about the ABC's vibe, if you could use that word, it leans to the left, and the ABC is at its best, in fact, when it tacks to the centre, as indeed I think it's obliged by its duty of impartiality, yes, its charter to do. Now, bias is in the eye of the beholder, and therefore to talk about bias, I've always talked about where I come from politically in order to be able to assess the question of bias. So I'm from Melbourne, and so not unusually, I'm an economic conservative, being a business person. I'm socially progressive, and I'm a foreign policy hawk. I believe the West should be militant, vigilant in the defence of its own interests. So that's where I come from. The question is, how does the ABC perform against those criteria? And I think in many respects, the question is, what could be done to make the ABC appear to be more balanced in the eyes of those who criticise it? By the way, the criticisms don't always come from the right. They also come from the left. There are many who say, and I've been in the position where I've given a short interview, and immediately after there are talkback callers, and some say he was too far to the right, and some say he was too far to the left.
Critics from both perspectives.
So there are critics from both.
No one could argue that ABC is a right-leaning organisation. I mean, it doesn't have any conservative voices. Its political editor, Laura Tingle, has tweeted against the Morrison government very strongly. There aren't many Jewish journalists there, certainly no journalists who support Israel, if at least vocally. So it does lean to the left unquestionably, objectively.
Well, it's not true. It's not true that there are not many Jewish journalists. I mean, there have been, particularly in Melbourne, there was a time when, both on the way to work and on the way home from work, you'd be listening to somebody who was a member of the Jewish community.
Well, I should say Jewish journalists who support Israel.
Well,
but my question is...
but even there, but I agree with you. So yes, I agree with your basic premise that if you wanted to...
Has the board tried to do anything to address
the answer,
bias
the answer
in editorial content?
The answer is yes. The answer is yes.
What does it try to do?
But do understand that the board sets editorial policy. The board does not control content. The management of the ABC runs the ABC and fiercely guards the ABC's independence. Decisions are ultimately made by David Anderson as editor-in-chief, and there is a process for dealing with complaints.
So about that process. So when you or others on the board try to uphold the independence, try to uphold the editorial balance that is stipulated in the ABC's charter, what happens then?
No, it's actually an obligation of... It's an obligation of impartiality. Fair and balanced is Fox News. But the ABC does have an obligation of impartiality. And there are 2 or 3 things which have been done which are significant and which I think should be recognised as significant. The first is the appointment of the Ombudsman, which was designed to ensure that there was a voice who understood the charter obligations of the ABC, but it was also going to be responsive to complaints. The complaint was made not so much that the ABC didn't deal with complaints, but it was too defensive. And so we now have an ombudsman who I think is both credentialed and fearless in calling it out when it needs to be called out, and has already in the short time that she's been in the role.
Yeah.
But the other is, and I know that there are critics of this part of the ABC's work, but nonetheless, the ABC's policy of diversity and inclusion writ large, because, for example, the move of part of the news team, or quite a large part of the news team, to Parramatta, apart from the fact that it's going to be a proof of concept in terms of a modern newsroom, also means that ABC people will be spread geographically in terms of diversity.
So that's an attempt to deal with this inner city mentality.
It's an attempt to deal with a number of things. First of all, and primarily to modernise the news gathering and the news presentation, because that does require some physical changes, but also to bring the ABC people from a wide and diverse range.
Yeah.
It is true that if you live in Ultimo or the inner leafy suburbs of Melbourne, as I do, almost everybody you meet shares the same views. And Ita Buttrose, early in her term, called that unconscious bias. You don't realise that you're biased, you simply come from a world in which everybody more or less agrees with you or has the same viewpoint.
And that's happening at the ABC.
And that is, it happens in many organisations. Perhaps I might be so bold as to say this one.
Well, I was going to say, on Sky News, we have Labor figures, we have Liberal figures. I just had Bill Shorten on my show.
So does the ABC.
Commentators and hosts as well. We have Peter Credden, we have Stephen Conroy, but on the ABC there are no, or virtually no, Conservative hosts.
Well, I'm not here to debate whether.
But should there be? Have you encouraged this during your tenure on the board?
The headline of the Financial Review article which led to this interview was the ABC should have more Conservative voices. It's not the case that there are no Conservative voices. I don't know how the allegation. I don't. Well, it depends what you call conservative.
Who do you think is a Conservative host on the ABC?
I'm not going to name names, not for good reason.
Because there are none.
No, that's not the case. That's not the case. But I would say,
except for Tom Switzer.
There are any number of people appear on the ABC. Is Greg Sheridan Conservative? Is Paul Kelly?
I'm saying employees of the ABC, hosts of ABC.
We'll go on, because what will happen is we're going to have to start parsing the words of various of the commentators on the ABC. I agree with the premise that there should be more Conservative voices. The ABC is at its best when it has both sides. And sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's not so easy. There are some questions on which it's easy to say, well, there are two sides, Labor and Liberal in an election, yes and no in the Voice campaign. But there are many other issues where it's not so perfectly clear who's one side and who's the other, and issues have all kinds of degree of nuance. So I think the notion that the ABC is not aware of its charter obligations is not the case. All right. Thank you very much for your time, Joe Gersh.
It's my pleasure. I appreciate having the conversation with you.
Anytime. Thank you.
Here in Sydney.